Now, let's drift off to sleep. Today, you'll be falling asleep during a thunderstorm inside of a cozy camper trailer next to a lake in the mountains. Imagine you are feeling exhausted, hot, and sweaty as you return to your camper. You've just conquered your long-held dream of hiking to the very summit of Moonrest Mountain. You've changed into your swimsuit and are now standing at the edge of the dock on weary, trembling legs, ready to celebrate your incredible achievement with a refreshing dive into the cool, crystal-clear waters of Silver Lake. With your arms raised above your head and ready to dive in, you glance at the slow-moving dark clouds on the horizon. Beads of sweat are still clinging to your forehead when you push off the dock and soar through the air before gliding perfectly into the water. The crisp, cool water envelops you, gently massaging your entire being. You can almost taste the clean, mineral freshness of the water as it washes away all the sweat, dust, and grime from your skin. While breathing in deeply, you are met with the glorious sense of renewal. You feel utterly refreshed and rejuvenated. You swim back to the dock and climb the cool aluminum ladder. Then, standing there with a soft cotton towel draped around your shoulders, you gaze out across the deep blue lake. Here and there, motorboats, canoes, sailboats, and jet skis are now headed towards the shores. Everyone knows rain is coming. Kids wearing life vests and learning how to water ski are hoisted back into boats, and the small, colorful sails of dinghies flutter in the breeze as their little suntanned captains point them back towards land. Now, all toweled off and feeling a little bit chilled, you walk barefoot back to your camper ahead of the rain. At the little picnic table, you collect your book, coffee mug, and sunglasses. You gather up other items and place them into a plastic tote. A salt and pepper shaker, a box of wooden matches, some paper plates. You secure the lid on the tote and move the Coleman lantern under the table. At the fire pit, you fold up your camping chair and tuck it below the protective cover of a tall ponderosa pine. Then you return to your camper, open the door, and step inside. In the little kitchenette, you set water to boil for tea. And then you change into your favorite, coziest leisure wear. while the hot tea steeps, you settle at the quaint table and gaze out the window, watching as boats reach the shore and families hurry off to their campers and tents and cabins. Now, with a warm cup of tea in hand and nestled in your soft, comfy clothes, you feel your body slowly warming again. You bring the mug to your lips. The fragrant steam curls around your face as you take a tiny sip. The tea is smooth, rich, and the perfect temperature. You take a bigger sip, and the tea flows down to your core, melting away the chill from the lake. A rush of warmth spreads throughout your body, like a wave of little goosebumps, and you're suddenly filled with a sense of deep accomplishment, peace, and satisfaction. Now, as you sit here at Silver Lake, let's prepare for sleep. First, close your eyes and simply become aware of your breathing, feeling your chest gently rise and fall again. Next, let's take a few deeper breaths. We will slowly fill our lungs with the cool, sweet scent of pine trees and that fresh mountain air. And then, after holding briefly, we will let it all go and exhale. Ready? Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and then exhale. One more time. Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and exhale. And try thinking to yourself, as I am here at Silver Lake, I can feel gravity pulling me back towards Earth. With every exhale, I can feel the slow rotation of Earth and the Earth's steady movement around the sun. I can feel my tired feet, my ankles, my fatigued calves, my knees, and my legs becoming heavier and heavier and more relaxed. You finish the last sip of your perfect tea, and then you pick up a little pencil and notebook resting on the table. With them in hand, you make your way to the sleeping nook at the other end of the camper, where you collapse heavily into the soft, wide bed. After the long, steep hike up Moonrest Mountain, the bed feels like a soft cloud beneath your tired body. The little windows by the bed are cracked open, and your nostrils catch the pleasant scent of fresh rain on pine needles and moss. You look at your notepad and observe your to-do list. Each completed task is neatly crossed out with pencil. At the bottom of the page is one final entry on this list. A smile creeps across your face as you take the pencil and begin scribbling over that last item: climb Moonrest Mountain. You set the notepad aside, thinking how perfect everything feels at this moment. You've completed everything you set out to do here. Tomorrow holds no obligations, and for now, everything is done, finished, and complete. You have earned this wonderful moment of absolute peace. Your body sinks deeper into the soft bed. Every muscle relaxes from the tips of your fingers to the soles of your tired feet as you surrender to the peace and calm and take in the rich mountain air. Let's take a few more deep breaths before drifting off to sleep. Ready? Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and then exhale. One more time. Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and exhale. Try thinking to yourself, as I lay here at Silver Lake, I can feel gravity pulling me back towards Earth. With every exhale, I experience my body feeling heavier and heavier and more relaxed. I can feel my tired arms, my hands, my torso, shoulders, neck, and head becoming heavier and more relaxed. My whole body feels at peace as gravity's pull tugs me gently and tucks me safely into this ever so soft bed. Now, feeling oh so satisfied, safe, accomplished, rejuvenated, sleepy, and happy, you reach over to a little transistor radio, tune it to your favorite station, then lay back and close your eyes.
This reading of the British report on the loss of the Titanic begins with the introduction and description of the ship. Originally published in 1912 by the Wreck Commissioners Court of Inquiry in London, the report is written in the careful, deliberate language of its time, formal, precise, and without ornament. In these opening sections, the commissioners outline the purpose of the inquiry, the origins of the White Star Line, and the construction of the steamship Titanic, her engines, her watertight compartments, her decks, and her accommodations. Together they form a measured portrait of a vessel admired for her design and ambition, described here before history had yet altered her course. Loss of the steamship Titanic. report of a formal investigation into the circumstances attending the foundering on April 15, 1912, of the British steamship Titanic of Liverpool, after striking ice in or near latitude 41 degrees 46 minutes north, longitude 50 degrees 14 minutes west, North Atlantic Ocean, whereby loss of life ensued. Introduction. On April 23, 1912, the Lord Chancellor appointed a wreck commissioner under the Merchant Shipping Acts, and on April 26th, the Home Secretary nominated 5 assessors. On April 30th, the Board of Trade requested that a formal investigation of the circumstances attending the loss of the steamship Titanic should be held, and the court accordingly commenced to sit on May 2nd. Since that date, there have been 37 public sittings at which 97 witnesses have been examined, while a large number of documents, charts, and plans have been produced. The 26 questions formulated by the Board of Trade, which are set out in detail below, appear to cover all the circumstances to be inquired into. Briefly summarized, they deal with the history of the ship, her design, construction, size, speed, general equipment, life-saving apparatus, wireless installation, her orders and course, her passengers, her crew, their training, organization, and discipline. They request an account of the casualty, its cause and effect, and of the means taken for saving those on board the ship. And they call for a report on the efficiency of the rules and regulations made by the Board of Trade under the Merchant Shipping Acts, and on their administration, and finally, for any recommendations to obviate similar disasters which may appear to the court to be desirable. The 26 questions, as subsequently amended, are here attached. 1. When the Titanic left Queenstown on or about April 11th last, A. What was the total number of persons employed in any capacity on board her, and what were their respective ratings? B. What was the total number of her passengers, distinguishing sexes and classes, and discriminating between adults and children? 2. Before leaving Queenstown on or about April 11th last, did the Titanic comply with the requirements of the Merchant Shipping Acts 1894 to 1906 and the rules and regulations made thereunder with regard to the safety and otherwise of passenger steamers and emigrant ships? 3. In the actual design and construction of the Titanic, what special provisions were made for the safety of the vessel and the lives of those on board in the event of collisions and other casualties? 4. Was the Titanic sufficiently and efficiently officered and manned? Were the watches of the officers and crew usual and proper? Was the Titanic supplied with proper charts? 5. What was the number of the boats of any kind on board the Titanic? Were the arrangements for manning and launching the boats on board the Titanic in case of emergency proper and sufficient? Had a boat drill been held on board? And if so, when? What was the carrying capacity of the respective boats? 6. What installations for receiving and transmitting messages by wireless telegraphy were on board the Titanic? How many operators were employed on working such installations? Were the installations in good and effective working order, and were the number of operators sufficient to enable messages to be received and transmitted continuously by day and night? 7. At or prior to the sailing of the Titanic, what, if any, instructions as to navigation were given to the master or known by him to apply to her voyage? Were such instructions, if any, safe, proper, and adequate, having regard to the time of year and dangers likely to be encountered during the voyage? 8. What was in fact the track taken by the Titanic in crossing the Atlantic Ocean? Did she keep to the track, usually followed by liners on voyages from the United Kingdom to New York in the month of April? Are such tracks safe tracks at that time of the year? Had the master any, and if so, what discretion as regards the track to be taken? 9. After leaving Queenstown on or about April 11th last, did information reach the Titanic by wireless messages or otherwise by signals of the existence of ice in certain latitudes? If so, what were such messages or signals, and when were they received, and in what position or positions was the ice reported to be? And was the ice reported in or near the track actually being followed by the Titanic? Was her course altered in consequence of receiving such information, and if so, in what way? What replies to such messages or signals did the Titanic send, and at what times? 10. If at the times referred to in the last preceding question, or later, the Titanic was warned of or had reason to suppose she would encounter ice, at what time might she have reasonably expected to encounter it? Was a good and proper lookout for ice kept on board? Were any, and if so, what directions given to vary the speed? If so, were they carried out? 11. Were binoculars provided for and used by the lookout men? Is the use of them necessary or usual in such circumstances? Had the Titanic the means of throwing searchlights around her? If so, did she make use of them to discover ice? Should searchlights have been provided and used? 12. What other precautions were taken by the Titanic in anticipation of meeting ice? Were they such as are usually adopted by vessels being navigated in waters where ice may be expected to be encountered? 13. Was ice seen and reported by anybody on board the Titanic before the casualty occurred? If so, what measures were taken by the officer on watch to avoid it? Were they proper measures, and were they promptly taken? 14. What was the speed of the Titanic shortly before and at the moment of the casualty? Was such speed excessive under the circumstances? 15. What was the nature of the casualty which happened to the Titanic at or about 11:45 p.m. on April 14th last? In what latitude and longitude did the casualty occur? 16. What steps were taken immediately on the happening of the casualty? How long after the casualty was its seriousness realized by those in charge of the vessel? What steps were then taken? What endeavors were made to save the lives of those on board and to prevent the vessel from sinking? 17. Was proper discipline maintained on board after the casualty occurred? 18. What messages for assistance were sent by the Titanic after the casualty, and at what times, respectively? What messages were received by her in response, and at what times, respectively? By what vessels were the messages that were sent by the Titanic received? And from what vessels did she receive answers? What vessels other than the Titanic sent or received messages at or shortly after the casualty in connection with such casualty? What were the vessels that sent or received such messages? Were any vessels prevented from going to the assistance of the Titanic or her boats owing to messages received from the Titanic, or owing to any erroneous messages being sent or received? In regard to such erroneous messages, from what vessels were they sent, and by what vessels were they received, and at what times, respectively? 19. Was the apparatus for lowering the boats on the Titanic at the time of the casualty in good working order? Were the boats swung out, filled, lowered, or otherwise put into the water and got away under proper superintendence? Were the boats sent away in seaworthy condition and properly manned, equipped, and provisioned? Did the boats, whether those under davits or otherwise, prove to be efficient and serviceable for the purpose of saving life? 20. What was the number of A passengers, B crew taken away in each boat on leaving the vessel? How was this number made up, having regard to 1 sex, 2 class, 3 rating? How many were children and how many adults? Did each boat carry its full load? And if not, why not? 21. How many persons on board the Titanic at the time of the casualty were ultimately rescued, and by what means? How many lost their lives prior to the arrival of the steamship Carpathia in New York? What was the number of passengers distinguishing between men and women and adults and children of the first, second, and third classes, respectively, who were saved? What was the number of the crew discriminating their ratings and sex that were saved? What is the proportion which each of these numbers bears to the corresponding total number on board immediately before the casualty? What reason is there for the disproportion, if any? 22. What happened to the vessel from the happening of the casualty until she foundered? 23. Where and at what time did the Titanic founder? 24. What was the cause of the loss of the Titanic and of the loss of life which thereby ensued or occurred? What vessels had the opportunity of rendering assistance to the Titanic, and if any, how was it that assistance did not reach the Titanic before the steamship Carpathia arrived? Was the construction of the vessel and its arrangements such as to make it difficult for any class of passengers or any portion of the crew to take full advantage of any of the existing provisions for safety? 25. When the Titanic left Queenstown on or about April 11th last, was she properly constructed and adequately equipped as a passenger steamer and emigrant ship for the Atlantic service? 26. The court is invited to report upon the rules and regulations made under the Merchant Shipping Acts 1894 to 1906, and the administration of those acts and of such rules and regulations, so far as the consideration thereof is material to this casualty, and to make any recommendations or suggestions that it may think fit, having regard to the circumstances of the casualty with a view to promoting the safety of vessels and persons at sea. In framing this report, it has seemed best to divide it into sections in the following manner. First, a description of the ship as she left Southampton on April 10th, and of her equipment, crew, and passengers. Second, an account of her journey across the Atlantic, of the messages she received, and of the disaster. Third, a description of the damage to the ship and of its gradual and final effect with observations thereon. Fourth, an account of the saving and rescue of those who survived. Fifth, the circumstances in connection with the steamship Californian. Sixth, an account of the Board of Trade's administration. Seventh, the finding of the court on the questions submitted. And eighth, the recommendations held to be desirable. 1. Description of the ship. The White Star Line. The Titanic was one of a fleet of 13 ships employed in the transport of passengers, mails, and cargo between Great Britain and the United States. The usual ports of call for the service in which she was engaged being Southampton, Cherbourg, Plymouth, Queenstown, and New York. The owners are the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company Limited, usually known as the White Star Line, a British registered company with a capital of £750,000, all paid up, the directors being Mr. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman, the Right Honorable Lord Peary, and Mr. H. A. Sanderson. The company are owners of 29 steamers and tenders. They have a large interest in 13 other steamers and also own a training sailing ship for officers. All the shares of the company, with the exception of 8 held by Messrs. E. C. Grenfell, Vivian H. Smith, W. S. M. Burns, James Gray, J. Bruce Ismay, H. A. Sanderson, A. Kerr, and the Right Honorable Lord Peary have, since the year 1902, been held by the International Navigation Company Limited of Liverpool, a British registered company with a capital of £700,000, of which all is paid up, the directors being Mr. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman, and Messrs. H. A. Sanderson, Charles F. Torrey, and H. Concannon. The debentures of the company, £1,250,000, are held mainly, if not entirely, in the United Kingdom by the general public. The International Navigation Company Limited of Liverpool, in addition to holding the above-mentioned shares of the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company Limited, is also the owner of 1. Practically the whole of the issued share capital of the British and North Atlantic Steam Navigation Company Limited and the Mississippi and Dominion Steamship Company Limited, the Dominion Line. 2. Practically the whole of the issued share capital of the Atlantic Transport Company Limited, the Atlantic Transport Line. 3. Practically the whole of the issued ordinary share capital and about 1/2 of the preference share capital of Frederick Leyland and Company Limited, the Leyland Line. As against the above-mentioned shares and other property, the International Navigation Company Limited have issued share lien certificates for £25 million. Both the shares and share lien certificates of the International Navigation Company Limited are now held by the International Mercantile Marine Company of New Jersey or by trustees for the holders of its debenture bonds. The steamship Titanic. The Titanic was a 3-screw vessel of 46,328 tons gross and 21,831 net register tons, built by Messrs. Harland and Wolff for the White Star Line service between Southampton and New York. She was registered as a British steamship at the port of Liverpool, her official number being 131,428. Her registered dimensions were length 852.50 feet, breadth 92.50 feet, depth from top of keel to top of beam at lowest point of shear of sea deck, the highest deck which extends continuously from bow to stern 64.75 feet, depth of hold 59.58 feet, height from B to C deck 9.00 feet, height from A to B deck 9.00 feet, height from boat to A deck 9.50 feet, height from boat deck to waterline amidships at time of accident about 60.50 feet. Displacement at 34 feet 7 inches is 52,310 tons. The propelling machinery consisted of 2 sets of 4-cylinder reciprocating engines, each driving a wing propeller and a turbine driving the center propeller. The registered horsepower of the propelling machinery was 50,000. The power which would probably have been developed was at least 55,000. The structural arrangements of the Titanic consisted primarily of 1. An outer shell of steel plating, giving form to the ship up to the top decks. 2. Steel decks. 3. Transverse vertical bulkheads. Detailed description. The following is a more detailed description of the vessel, her passenger and crew accommodation, and her machinery. Watertight compartments. The vessel was constructed under survey of the British Board of Trade for a passenger certificate and also to comply with the American immigration laws. Steam was supplied from 6 entirely independent groups of boilers in 6 separate watertight compartments. The after boiler room number 1 contained 5 single-ended boilers. 4 other boiler rooms, numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5, each contained 5 double-ended boilers. The forward boiler room number 6 contained 4 double-ended boilers. The reciprocating engines and most of the auxiliary machinery were in a 7th separate watertight compartment aft of the boilers. The low-pressure turbine, the main condensers, and the thrust blocks of the reciprocating engine were in an 8th separate watertight compartment. The main electrical machinery was in a 9th separate watertight compartment immediately abaft the turbine engine room. 2 emergency steam-driven dynamos were placed on the D deck, 21 feet above the level of the load water line. These dynamos were arranged to take their supply of steam from any of the 3 of the boiler rooms, numbers 2, 3, and 5, and were intended to be available in the event of the main dynamo room being flooded. The ship was equipped with the following: 1. Wireless telegraphy. 2. Submarine signaling. 3. Electric lights and power systems. 4. Telephones for communication between the different working positions in the vessel. In addition to the telephones, the means of communication included engine and docking telegraphs, and duplicate or emergency engine room telegraph to be used in the event of any accident to the ordinary telegraph. 5. 3 electric elevators for taking passengers in the first class up to A deck, immediately below the boat deck, and 1 in the second class for taking passengers up to the boat deck. 6. 4 electrically driven boat winches on the boat deck for hauling up the boats. 7. Life-saving appliances to the requirements of the Board of Trade, including boats and life belts. 8. Steam whistles on the 2 foremost funnels. Worked on the Willett-Bruce system of automatic control. 9. Navigation appliances, including Kelvin's patent sounding machines for finding the depth of water under the ship without stopping. Walker's taffrail log for determining the speed of the ship, and flash signal lamps fitted above the shelters at each of the navigating bridge for Morse signaling with other ships. Decks and accommodation. The boat deck was an uncovered deck on which the boats were placed. At its lowest point, it was about 92 feet 6 inches above the keel. The overall length of this deck was about 500 feet. The forward end of it was fitted to serve as the navigating bridge of the vessel and was 190 feet from the bow. On the after end of the bridge was a wheelhouse containing the steering wheel and a steering compass. The chart room was immediately abaft this. On the starboard side of the wheelhouse and funnel casing were the navigating room, the captain's quarters, and some officers' quarters. On the port side were the remainder of the officers' quarters. At the middle line, abaft the forward funnel casing, were the wireless telegraphy rooms and the operators' quarters. The top of the officers' house formed a short deck. The connections from the Marconi aerials were made on this deck, and 2 of the collapsible boats were placed on it. Aft of the officer's house were the first-class passengers' entrance and stairways and other adjuncts to the passengers' accommodation below. These stairways had a minimum effective width of 8 feet. They had assembling landings at the level of each deck and 3 elevators communicating from E to A decks, but not to the boat deck, immediately on the foreside of the stairway. All the boats except 2 Engelhart life rafts were carried on this deck. There were 7 lifeboats on each side, 30 feet long, 9 feet wide. There was an emergency cutter, 25 feet long, on each side at the fore end of the deck. Abreast of each cutter was an Engelhart life raft. 1 similar raft was carried on the top of the officer's house on each side. In all, there were 14 lifeboats, 2 cutters, and 4 Engelhart life rafts. The forward group of 4 boats and 1 Engelhart raft were placed on each side of the deck, alongside the officers' quarters and the first-class entrance. Further aft at the middle line on this deck was a special platform for the standard compass. At the after end of this deck was an entrance house for second-class passengers, with a stairway and elevator leading directly down to F deck. There were 2 vertical iron ladders at the after end of this deck, leading to A deck for the use of the crew. Alongside and immediately forward of the second-class entrance was the after group of lifeboats, 4 on each side of the ship. In addition to the main stairways mentioned, there was a ladder on each side amidships, giving access from the A deck below. At the forward end of the boat deck, there was on each side a ladder leading up from A deck with a landing there, from which by a ladder access to B deck could be obtained direct. Between the reciprocating engine casing and the third funnel casing, there was a steward's stairway which communicated with all the decks below as far as E deck. Outside the deck houses was promenading space for first-class passengers. A deck. The next deck below the boat deck was A deck. It extended over a length of about 500 feet. On this deck was a long house extending nearly the whole length of the deck. It was of irregular shape, varying in width from 24 feet to 72 feet. At the forward end it contained 34 staterooms, and abaft these a number of public rooms, etc., for first-class passengers, including 2 first-class entrances and stairway, reading room, lounge, and the smoke room. Outside the deck house was a promenade for first-class passengers. The forward end of it on both sides of the ship, below the forward group of boats, and for a short distance farther aft, was protected against the weather by a steel screen, 192 feet long, with large windows in it. In addition to the stairway described on the boat deck, there was near the after end of the A deck and immediately forward of the first-class smoke room another first-class entrance, giving access as far down as C deck. The second-class stairway at the after end of this deck, already described under the boat deck, had no exit onto the A deck. The steward's staircase opened onto this deck, B deck. The next lowest deck was B deck, which constituted the top deck of the strong structure of the vessel, decks above, and the side plating between them being light plating. This deck extended continuously for 550 feet. There were breaks or wells both forward and aft of it, each about 50 feet long. It was terminated by a poop and forecastle. On this deck were placed the principal staterooms of the vessel, 97 in number, having berths for 198 passengers, and aft of these was the first-class stairway and reception room, as well as the restaurant for first-class passengers and its pantry and galley. Immediately aft of this restaurant were the second-class stairway and smoke room. At the forward end of the deck outside the house was an assembling area, giving access by the ladders previously mentioned, leading directly to the boat deck. From this same space, a ladderway led to the forward third-class promenade on C deck. At the after end of it were 2 ladders giving access to the after third-class promenade on C deck. At the after end of this deck, at the middle line, was placed another second-class stairway, which gave access to C, D, E, F, and G decks. At the forward end of the vessel, on the level of the B deck, was situated the forecastle deck, which was 125 feet long. On it were placed the gear for working the anchors and cables and for warping or moving the ship in dock. At the after end, on the same level, was the poop deck, about 105 feet long, which carried the after warping appliances and was a third-class promenading space. Arranged above the poop was a light docking bridge with telephone, telegraphs, etc., communicating to the main navigating bridge forward. C deck. The next lowest deck was C deck. This was the highest deck, which extended continuously from bow to stern. At the forward end of it, under the forecastle, was placed the machinery required for working the anchors and cables and for the warping of the ship referred to on B deck above. There were also the crew's galley and the seamen's and firemen's mess room accommodation, where their meals were taken. At the after end of the forecastle, at each side of the ship, were the entrances to the third-class spaces below. On the port side, at the extreme after end and opening onto the deck, was the lamp room. The break in B deck between the forecastle and the first-class passenger quarters formed a well about 50 feet in length, which enabled the space under it on C deck to be used as a third-class promenade. This space contained 2 hatchways, the number 2 hatch and the bunker hatch. The latter of these hatchways gave access to the space allotted to the first and second-class baggage hold, the mails, specie, and parcel room, and to the lower hold, which was used for cargo or coals. Abaft of this well there was a house 450 feet long and extending for the full breadth of the ship. It contained 148 staterooms for first class, besides service rooms of various kinds. On this deck, at the forward first-class entrance, were the purser's office and the inquiry office, where passengers' telegrams were received for sending by the Marconi apparatus. Exit doors through the ship's side were fitted abreast of this entrance. Abaft the after end of this long house was a promenade at the ship's side for second-class passengers, sheltered by bulwarks and bulkheads. In the middle of the promenade stood the second-class library. The two second-class stairways were at the ends of the library, so that from the promenade access was obtained at each end to a second-class main stairway. There was also access by a door from this space into each of the alleyways in the first-class accommodation on each side of the ship, and by two doors at the after end into the afterwell. This afterwell was about 50 feet in length and contained two hatchways called number 5 and number 6 hatches. Abaft this well, under the poop, was the main third-class entrance for the after end of the vessel, leading directly down to G-deck, with landings and access at each deck. The effective width of this stairway was 16 feet to E-deck. From E to F, it was 8 feet wide. Aft of this entrance on B-deck were the third-class smoke room and the general room. Between these rooms and the stern was the steam steering gear and the machinery for working the after capstan gear, which was used for warping the after end of the vessel. The steam steering gear had 3 cylinders. The engines were in duplicate to provide for the possibility of breakdown of one set. D-deck. The general height from D-deck to C-deck was 10 feet 6 inches, this being reduced to 9 feet at the forward end and 9 feet 6 inches at the after end, taper being obtained gradually by increasing the shear of the D-deck. The forward end of this deck provided accommodation for 108 firemen who were in 2 separate watches. There was the necessary lavatory accommodation abaft the firemen's quarters at the sides of the ship. On each side of the middle line, immediately abaft the firemen's quarters, there was a vertical spiral staircase leading to the forward end of a tunnel immediately above the tank top, which extended from the foot of the staircase to the forward stoke hole, so that the firemen could pass direct to their work without going through any passenger accommodation or over any passenger decks. On D-deck abaft of this staircase was the third-class promenade space, which was covered in by C-deck. From this promenade space there were 4 separate ladderways with 2 ladders, 4 feet wide to each. One ladderway on each side forward led to C-deck, and one, the starboard, led to E-deck, and continued to F-deck as a double ladder and to G-deck as a single ladder. The 2 ladderways at the after end led to E-deck on both sides and to F-deck on the port side. Abaft this promenade space came a block of 50 first-class staterooms. This surrounded the forward funnel. The main first-class reception room and dining saloon were aft of these rooms and surrounded the number 2 funnel. The reception room and staircase occupied 83 feet of the length of the ship. The dining saloon occupied 112 feet and was between the second and third funnels. Abaft this came the first-class pantry, which occupied 56 feet of the length of the ship. The reciprocating engine hatch came up through this pantry. Aft of the first-class pantry, the galley, which provides for both first and second-class passengers, occupied 45 feet of the length of the ship. Aft of this were the turbine engine hatch and the emergency dynamos. Abaft of and on the port side of this hatch were the second-class pantry and other spaces used for the saloon service of the passengers. On the starboard side abreast of these, there was a series of rooms used for hospitals and their attendants. These spaces occupied about 54 feet of the length Aft of these was the second-class saloon, occupying 70 feet of the length. In the next 88 feet of length, there were 38 second-class rooms and the necessary baths and lavatories. From here to the stern was accommodation for third-class passengers and the main third-class lavatories for the passengers in the after end of the ship. The watertight bulkheads come up to this deck throughout the length from the stern as far forward as the bulkhead dividing the after boiler room from the reciprocating engine room. The watertight bulkhead of the two compartments abaft the stem was carried up to this deck, E-deck. The watertight bulkheads, other than those mentioned as extending to D-deck, all stopped at this deck. At the forward end was provided accommodation for 3 watches of trimmers in 3 separate compartments, each holding 24 trimmers. Abaft this, on the port side, was accommodation for 44 seamen. Aft of this, and also on the starboard side of it, were the lavatories for crew and third-class passengers. Further aft again came the forward third-class lavatories. Immediately aft of this was a passageway right across the ship, communicating directly with the ladderways leading to the decks above and below and gangway doors in the ship's side. This passage was 9 feet wide at the sides and 15 feet at the center of the ship. From the after end of this cross passage, main alleyways on each side of the ship ran right through to the after end of the vessel. That on the port side was about 8.5 feet wide. It was the general communication passage for the crew and third-class passengers, and was known as the working passage. In this passage at the center line in the middle of the length of the ship, direct access was obtained to the third-class dining rooms on the deck below by means of a ladderway 20 feet wide. Between the working passage and the ship's side was the accommodation for the petty officers, most of the stewards, and the engineer's mess room. This accommodation extended for 475 feet. From this passage, access was obtained to both engine rooms and the engineer's accommodation, some third-class lavatories, and also some third-class accommodation at the after end. There was another cross passage at the end of this accommodation about 9 feet wide, terminating in gangway doors on each side of the ship. The port side of it was for third-class passengers and the starboard for second class. A door divided the parts, but it could be opened for any useful purpose or for an emergency. The second-class stairway leading to the boat deck was in the cross passageway. The passage on the starboard side ran through the first and then the second-class accommodation, and the forward main first-class stairway and elevators extended to this deck, whilst both the second-class main stairways were also in communication with this starboard passage. There were 4 first-class, 8 first or second alternatively, and 19 second-class rooms leading off this starboard passage. The remainder of the deck was appropriated to third-class accommodation. This contained the bulk of the third-class accommodation. At the forward end of it was the accommodation for 53 firemen, constituting the third watch. Aft of this, in 3 watertight compartments, there was third-class accommodation extending to 147 feet. In the next watertight compartment were the swimming bath and linen rooms. In the next watertight compartments were stewards' accommodation on the port side and the Turkish baths on the starboard side. The next 2 watertight compartments each contained a third-class dining room. The third-class steward's accommodation, together with the third-class galley and pantries, filled the watertight compartment. The engineer's accommodation was in the next compartment directly alongside the casing of the reciprocating engine room. The next 3 compartments were allotted to 64 second-class staterooms. These communicated direct with the second-class main stairways. The after compartments contained third-class accommodation. All spaces on this deck had direct ladderway communication with the deck above, so that if it became necessary to close the watertight doors and the bulkheads, an escape was available in all cases. On this deck, in the way of the boiler rooms, were placed the electrically driven fans which provided ventilation to the stokeholes. G-deck. The forward end of this deck had accommodation for 15 leading firemen and 30 greasers. The next watertight compartment contained third-class accommodation in 26 rooms for 106 people. The next watertight compartment contained the first-class baggage room, the post office accommodation, a racket court, and 7 third-class rooms for 34 passengers. From this point to the after end of the boiler room, space was used for the tween-deck bunkers. Alongside the reciprocating engine room were the engineers' stores and workshop. Abreast of the turbine engine room were some of the ship's stores. In the next watertight compartment abaft the turbine room were the main body of the stores. The next 2 compartments were appropriated to 186 third-class passengers in 60 rooms. This deck was the lowest on which any passengers or crew were carried. Below G-deck were 2 partial decks, the orlop and lower orlop decks, the latter extending only through the forepeak and number 1 hold. On the former deck, abaft the turbine engine room, were some storerooms containing stores for ship's use. Below these decks again came the inner bottom, extending fore and aft through about 9/10 of the vessel's length, and on this were placed the boilers, main and auxiliary machinery, and the electric light machines. In the remaining spaces below G-deck were cargo holds, or tween decks, 7 in all, 6 forward and 1 aft. The fireman's passage, giving direct access from their accommodation to the forward boiler room by stairs at the forward end, contained the various pipes and valves connected with the pumping arrangements at the forward end of the ship, and also the steam pipes conveying steam to the windlass gear forward and exhaust steam pipes leading from winches and other deck machinery. It was made thoroughly watertight throughout its length, and at its after end was closed by a watertight vertical sliding door of the same character as other doors on the inner bottom. Special arrangements were made for pumping this space out, if necessary. The pipes were placed in this tunnel to protect them from possible damage by coal or cargo, and also to facilitate access to them. On the decks was provided, generally, in the manner above described, accommodation for a maximum number of 1,034 first-class passengers, and at the same time 510 second-class passengers and 1,022 third-class passengers. Some of the accommodation was of an alternative character and could be used for either of 2 classes of passengers. In the statement of figures, the higher alternative class has been reckoned. This makes a total accommodation for 2,566 passengers. Accommodation was provided for the crew as follows. About 75 of the deck department, including officers and doctors, 326 of the engine room department, including engineers, and 544 of the victualling department, including pursers and leading stewards. Access of passengers to the boat deck. The following routes led directly from the various parts of the first-class passenger accommodation to the boat deck, from the forward ends of A, B, C, D, and E decks by the staircase and the forward first-class entrance direct to the boat deck. The elevators led from the same decks as far as A deck, where further access was obtained by going up the top flight of the main staircase. The same route was available for first-class passengers forward of midships on B, C, and E decks. First-class passengers abaft midships on B and C decks could use the staircase in the after main entrance to A deck, and then could pass out onto the deck and by the midship stairs beside the house ascend to the boat deck. They could also use the steward's staircase between the reciprocating engine casing and numbers 1 and 2 boiler casing, which led direct to the boat deck. This last route was also available for passengers on E deck in the same divisions who could use the forward first-class main stairway and elevators. Second-class passengers on D deck could use their own after stairway to B deck and could then pass up their forward stairway to the boat deck, or else could cross their saloon and use the same stairway throughout. Of the second-class passengers on E deck, those abreast of the reciprocating engine casing, unless the watertight door immediately abaft of them was closed, went aft and joined the other second-class passengers. If, however, the watertight door at the end of their compartment was closed, they passed through an emergency door into the engine room and directly up to the boat deck by the ladders and gratings in the engine room casing. The second-class passengers on E deck in the compartment abreast the turbine casing on the starboard side, and also those on F deck on both sides below, could pass through M watertight bulkhead to the forward second-class main stairway. If this door were closed, they could pass by the stairway up to the serving space at the forward end of the second-class saloon and go into the saloon and thence up the forward second-class stairway. Passengers between M and N bulkheads on both E and F decks could pass directly up to the forward second-class stairway to the boat deck. Passengers between N and O bulkheads on E, E, F, and G decks could pass by the after second-class stairway to B deck and then cross to the forward second-class stairway and go up to the boat deck. Third-class passengers at the fore end of the vessel could pass by the staircases to C deck in the forward well and by ladders on the port and starboard sides at the forward end of the deck houses, thence direct to the boat deck outside the officers' accommodation. They might also pass along the working passage on E deck and through the emergency door to the forward first-class main stairway, or through the door on the same deck at the forward end of the first-class alleyway and up the first-class stairway direct to the boat deck. The third-class passengers at the after end of the ship passed up their stairway to E deck and into the working passage and through the emergency doors to the two second-class stairways, so to the boat deck, like second-class passengers. Or, alternatively, they could continue up their own stairs and entrance to C deck, thence by the two ladders at the after end of the bridge onto the B deck, and thence by the forward second-class stairway, direct to the boat deck. Crew. From each boiler room, an escape or emergency ladder was provided direct to the boat deck by the fiddlies and the boiler casings, and also into the working passage on E deck, and thence by the stair immediately forward of the reciprocating engine casing direct to the boat deck. From both the engine rooms, ladders and gratings gave direct access to the boat deck. From the electric engine room, the after tunnels and the forward pipe tunnels escapes were provided direct to the working passage on E deck, and thence by one of the several routes already detailed from that space. From the crew's quarters, they could go forward by their own staircases into the forward well, and thence, like the third-class passengers, to the boat deck. The steward's accommodation being all connected to the working passage or the forward main first-class stairway, they could use one of the routes from thence. The engineer's accommodation also communicated with the working passage, but as it was possible for them to be shut between two watertight doors bulkheads, they had also a direct route by the gratings in the engine room casing to the boat deck. On all the principal accommodation decks, the alleyways and stairways provided a ready means of access to the boat deck, and there were clear deck spaces in way of all first, second, and third class main entrances and stairways on boat deck and all decks below.